just quickly want to recap some of the things that we've been looking so far in this super exciting series about the life of Jesus. So you may remember that we've seen how the Old Testament is absolutely essential to understanding Jesus. This is something we've really been trying to drill home, that if you don't read about the prophecies and the words about him in the Old Testament, it's really hard to understand Jesus completely in the New Testament. We've also seen how Jesus used a lot of the Old Testament scriptures to help him in his ministry. So it's not like the Old Testament is completely irrelevant. There's a lot of things that we can use to help us. And we saw with Jesus specifically how he used it to help him overcome temptation. And we've also seen how Jesus fulfilled and expanded on a lot of the Old Testament. And tonight what we want to do is look at how Jesus actually used the Old Testament to determine his course of action, how he knew he would complete the will of God. And we just want to set up the scene for the story that we're going to look at tonight a little bit. So up until this point, Jesus hasn't fully revealed who he is to the people. There's only a small group of people that actually know that he's the Messiah that they were looking for. Think of the disciples. Some of them knew this, but most people didn't think that's exactly what Jesus was claiming. But what happened was John the Baptist, who had been sent to prepare the way for Jesus, had now been taken to prison. He'd condemned Herod for something that Herod had done. Herod didn't like that. He put him in jail. And so it's as if Jesus took this as a signal that now that John's work of preparing the way was finished, it was time for himself to make his identity known. And so what he does is he goes to his hometown of Nazareth, and he goes into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he performs a reading. And it's a short reading from chapter 61, verse 1 and 2. And we'll look at this reading in a minute. But if you think about Isaiah chapter 61, it's in this broader context in the prophecy of Isaiah. And we have a chart of this context on the screen by the Bible Project. And this section in Isaiah actually reveals the entire work of the Messiah, or a lot of it. And so some of the details you can find about the work of the Messiah in this section is that the Messiah would suffer, he would die, the nation of Israel would actually reject their Messiah and kill him, but he would actually be resurrected. And then other nations could participate in that salvation, and this Messiah would one day return to establish God's kingdom. Now, there's a whole lot to unpack in this section of Isaiah. We're hardly touching the details at all. But one thing we want to take away is that these prophecies in Isaiah chapter 49 to 66, were hugely important to the Jews. The Messiah was the single most important thing that they hoped for. And so with that in mind, we come to our main story for tonight. And this verse in Luke chapter 4 says that Jesus returned to Galilee, and he goes to his hometown of Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up for to read. So the first thing we learn is that this is Jesus' custom. Every Sabbath day since he was a child, he'd be going to the synagogue and hearing the words of God spoken, specifically from the Old Testament, because this is how people were able to access the Bible. And I won't go too much into that because that's going to be part of our question of the week in a couple minutes. So what he does is he goes to the synagogue for to read, and it says, "There was delivered him the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written," and this comes from Isaiah 61, and it says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord." And he closed the book and gave it to the minister and sat down. And the eyes of all those that were in the synagogue were fastened on him. And this is what he says about those verses in Isaiah. He says, "This day are those scriptures fulfilled in your ears." Now that's a massive claim to say that all of these prophecies in Isaiah about the Messiah related to him. So first of all, could he back that up? Well, look what it says that this Messiah would do. Preach the gospel. He'd been doing that. Heal the brokenhearted, preach deliverance, recovering of sight. He'd been performing miracles and healing people of their many infirmities. He was to set at liberty the bruised and to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. These were all things that Jesus had already been doing and which he would continue to do in a much wider sense throughout the rest of his ministry. So yes, he could back up the claim that these things related to him. And it says the people that were listening in the synagogue, they bear him witness, and they wondered at the gracious words which came out of his mouth. So at first, they're wondering at these words that he said. They're amazed in a sense. But then notice what it says. And then they said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" So essentially what that means is these people had witnessed Jesus grow up in Nazareth from a young age. They knew he was Mary's son, Joseph's son. They'd watched him grow up. And now this child that had grown up with them for years is claiming that he is the Messiah. And so they're blown away by his teaching, but not in a good way. He was now claiming that he was the fulfillment of the prophecy of Isaiah. And so what they try to do, it says, all day in the synagogue, when they heard these things, they were filled with wrath. And they rose up and thrust him out of the city and led him to the brow of the hill whereon their city was built, that they might cast him down headlong. So they're trying to kill him for what he said. But Jesus, passing through the midst of them, went on his way. It wasn't his time yet to die, and so it wasn't going to happen on that day. Now, the principle we want to learn from that story is that Jesus read and understood the Old Testament. He'd been reading it his entire life, and he used that to determine how he was going to complete God's will. Now, we can expand on that a little bit. We know that Jesus understood these things because of a story in Luke chapter 2. And I think that this is one of the most interesting stories about the life of Jesus. It happens right near the beginning. So this is Luke chapter 2. It says, "Now his parents, Jesus' parents, went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when Jesus was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem after the custom of the feast." And what happens is, after they're done at the feast, Mary and Joseph, they pack up all their things, they go with the rest of their family, and they start the journey back home. But after a few days, they realize that Jesus isn't with them. And you think about the implications of that. God has basically entrusted to Mary his own son to watch over and protect and to help raise him in the world, and they've lost him. That's a huge implication. And so they're worried. They spend 3 days looking for him. They go back to Jerusalem to look for him. And it says, "It came to pass after 3 days that they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the doctors." And these would have been scholars of the Old Testament, both hearing them and asking them questions. And all they that heard him were astonished at his, that's Jesus, understanding and answers. So not only is he asking the questions, but they're asking him questions, and they're astonished at his answers. These older men who devoted their life to the study of the Hebrew Bible are being taught by 12-year-old Jesus. I think if there's any proof that Jesus knew his Bible, it's in this story. And so it says, when his parents saw him, they were amazed, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you thus dealt with us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorrowing." And Jesus said to them, "How is it that you sought me? Why were you looking for me? Didn't you know that I must be about my Father's business?" I think the implication there is that they were supposed to understand what Jesus was going to do. And Jesus mentions, "This is my Father's business, not Joseph's. This is God's business that he's given me to do." And he understood that from the Old Testament, and they should have understood that as well. So I guess there's a couple takeaways. So first of all, we've proved that Jesus used the Old Testament as a basis for how he would perform God's will. But one thing that we want to drive home through all of these sessions is that Jesus is our example. It's not just amazing seeing his life and all the things that he did and how he accomplished Old Testament prophecies. That is amazing, but it's not just about that. We're also supposed to be learning from him and trying to be like him as much as we can. And so in this context, that means that we should be trying to use the Bible as a set of directions in our life. Not saying that we should apply Old Testament prophecies about someone doing something to us, but we can learn from what the Bible says. Psalm 119, verse 105 is a very, very well-known verse, but it definitely applies in this context. It says, "Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light to my path." So the Bible can light the way for us. It can really direct us in our life. And 2 Timothy 3, verse 16 to 17, which we've certainly looked at before, says that all scripture is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. So tonight we've learned the importance of letting God speak to us through the Bible and letting that guide our life. And if you stick around in our Digging Deeper section, we're going to look at why we can trust that every single word of the Bible can be helpful to guide us in the right direction.